Why is Henry VIII so famous?
The reign of Henry VIII, from 1509 to 1547, is perhaps the most well-known Tudor monarchy. It was marked by papal conflicts and England's subsequent break with the Roman Catholic Church. When Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, 1485 to 1536, failed to produce a male heir, he appealed to the Pope to grant him a divorce. The request was of course denied. Though Henry went on to have his marriage to Catherine declared invalid, on the grounds that she was his brother's widow, and he secretly married Anne Boleyn, c. 1507 to 1536, in 1533, his troubles with the Church continued. In 1534 he set up the Church of England, declaring the monarch as its head. He went to extreme measures to ensure the act was upheld, even executing his appointed chancellor, Sir Thomas More, 1478 to 1535, for his refusal to acknowledge royal supremacy. Henry VIII was eventually successful in procuring a male heir to the throne, but it required a third marriage, to Jane Seymour, c. 1509 to 1537. His son, Edward VI, 1537 to 53, succeeded him in 1547. Nevertheless, it was Henry VIII's daughters who went on to make history. Mary I, who ruled England and Ireland from 1553 to 1558, was the daughter of Henry and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. In 1554 Mary wed Spain's Philip II, 1527 to 1598, forming a temporary alliance between the two powers. The following year she realigned England with the Catholic Church, undertaking the persecution of Protestants and earning herself the name Bloody Mary.
Why is the Iliad studied today?
Greek poet Homer's, c. 850-BC. Iliad and Odyssey, both works credited to him, are considered to be among the greatest works of literature and have had a profound influence on Western poetry, serving as the primary models for subsequent works, including the Aeneid, Virgil, and the Divine Comedy, Dante. The Iliad in particular can be seen as both the beginning of Western literature as we know it, and the culmination of a long tradition of oral epic poetry that may date as far back as the 13th century BC. The Iliad has been a part of Western education for nearly 3,000 years. The epic poem, telling the story of a 10-year Trojan War, reveals the author's keen understanding of human nature.
When did European colonialism begin?
Seeking out colonies for economic benefit dates back to ancient times. Even the Romans ruled colonies in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. But colonialism took hold during the Renaissance, between 1400 and 1600. When powerful European countries sent explorers to find new lands and forge new trade routes. Portugal and Spain sought sea routes to India and the Far East. In the process, the Portuguese gained control of what is now Brazil. They also established trading posts in West Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Spain gained control of most of Latin America and vast regions of what is now the United States. However, the Dutch, English, and French also had influence in these areas. And of course, the English eventually established 13 colonies in North America. The English also became a strong influence in India and Africa. While the Dutch gained control of the Indonesian islands, which became the Dutch East Indies. The results of colonialism were many. While trade was expanded and there was an enormous exchange of raw goods, the colonies were also rife with conflict. Indigenous peoples were killed or forcibly displaced from their lands. And foreign powers fought with each other for control of the same areas. The British and French fought 4 wars in North America between 1689 and 1763 alone. Further, Europeans brought to these new lands their own languages, religions, and systems of government, imposing their culture, beliefs, and ideologies on native peoples.
What happened in the blackout of 2003?
A 3-month investigation found that line failures and system errors combined to cause the power outage that hit much of the Northeast and Great Lakes portions of the United States, as well as parts of eastern Canada. On August 14, 2003, the blackout affected 50 million people, 40 million of them in the United States. A task force headed by the U.S. Department of Energy and its Canadian counterparts delved into the sequence of events that caused the massive power failure. Investigators concluded that mistakes made by First Energy Corporation of Akron, Ohio, had combined with heavy loads of power to stress the interstate electrical grid and cause its failure through a chain reaction. Just after 4 p.m. EDT. On Friday, August 14, power was knocked out from Detroit to Toronto to New York City. The widespread outage immediately affected water supplies, halted air transportation and subway systems, snarled ground transportation, and brought most distribution lines to a standstill, affecting the flow of food and other supplies. Though there were isolated reports of looting, crime was minimal, with New York City reporting a lower crime rate for the night of August 14 than usual. 8 deaths were related to the blackout. Power began to be restored to some areas later that evening, but it was August 16 before all affected areas were back online. 2 weeks later, on August 28, London experienced a blackout at the peak of evening rush hour. The outage paralyzed the British capital and left 500,000 commuters stranded. Power was restored within an hour. A utilities official said that The freak event was caused by two faults that happened in quick succession. In late September 2003 there were also widespread power outages in Denmark, Sweden, and Italy. The blackout in Italy affected the entire nation, with the exception of Sardinia, or 57 million people. Because it happened overnight and on a weekend, the impact was minimal. The blackouts drew attention to the need for system upgrades, improved maintenance, and more sophisticated alert systems to prevent such grid failures, which take both an economic and human toll.
When did MTV first air?
Music television, MTV, made its debut August 1, 1981. When it was made available to 2.1 million cable-subscribing households in the United States. The format was all music, 24 hours a day. Audiences could tune in any time to watch popular rock artists performing hit songs. The notion of pairing music with video was not without precedent. The most obvious of which is the Beatles' 1964 critically acclaimed pseudo-documentary, A Hard Day's Night. What was new was the idea of airing music videos around the clock. MTV was the brainchild of John Lack, vice president of Warner Amex Satellite Entertainment, which owned the cable station Nickelodeon. He'd taken interest in the Nickelodeon program Pop Clips, a music and video show developed by Michael Nesmith, a former member of the pop group The Monkees. Lack thought the format had potential, and soon a young executive, Robert Pittman, just 27 years old, was given charge of the project. MTV was launched with 13 advertisers and a meager library of only 125 videos, all provided by the record labels. But MTV caught on, and by 1984 it had captured an audience of more than 24 million viewers, was showing a profit, and was soon spun off into a separate company by parent company Warner. The video colossus thrived during the 1980s, helping launch more than a few music careers. However, in the following decade VJs, video jockeys, had to make way for alternate programming on the music channel in order to keep audiences interested. In addition to the standard video programs, including theme shows such as Yo! MTV Raps, the cable channel broadened its offerings to include specials. MTV Spring Break and MTV Video Music Awards, as well as series such as Real World, Road Rules, and The Osbournes. All of the new programming was aimed at the Generation X audience, the very group of teens and 20-somethings who, in the 1990s, couldn't remember not watching MTV. Even though its audience was estimated to have declined by more than half since its peak, MTV remained a going and profitable concern into the 2000s. As advertisers continued to rely on the medium to reach the youth market.
What did President George H. W. Bush mean when he said the U.S. had to draw a line in the sand?
President George H. W. Bush, 1924, was reacting to Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein's, 1937, act of aggression when on August 2, 1990, his troops invaded neighboring Kuwait. The United Nations, UN, gave Iraq until January 15, 1991, to withdraw from Kuwait. Iraq failed to comply. The line in the sand that Hussein crossed was soon defended. On January 16, 1991, Operation Desert Storm was launched to liberate the Arab nation of Kuwait from Iraq, whose military dictator had not only invaded Kuwait but proclaimed it a new Iraqi province. Bush averred, "This will not stand," and in order to protect U.S. oil supplies in the country, the president mobilized U.S. forces, which were joined by a coalition of 39 nations, to soundly and quickly defeat Iraq.
Would scientists soon be able to clone humans?
While technological advances continue to be made, government leaders around the world grapple with how to regulate the use of new life-giving technologies such as IVF.
What were Napoleon's 100 days?
The term refers to Napoleon Bonaparte's last 100 days as ruler of France. Having been defeated by his enemies, a coalition of European powers, Britain, Sweden, Austria, and Prussia, who aligned themselves against Napoleon's domination, the emperor abdicated the throne in the spring of 1814. And was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea. There he heard of the confusion and discontent that came after he had descended the throne. He left Elba, and with more than 1,000 men, arrived on the French coast at Caen and marched inland to Paris. Hearing of his arrival, the new Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, 1755 to 1824, fled. On March 20 Napoleon began a new reign, but it was only to last until the European allies defeated him again. At the Battle of Waterloo, June 12 through 18. After that battle, the so-called Little Corporal, for his diminutive stature, was permanently exiled to the British island of St. Helena, where he remained until his death in 1821.
When was the structure of DNA discovered?
In 1953, American biologist James Dewey Watson, 1928, and British biophysicist Francis Crick, 1916 to 2004, developed a model of the structure of DNA. Short for deoxyribonucleic acid, the acid found in cell nuclei. The scientists posited that DNA is constructed of a double helix, a spiral ladder, held together by hydrogen bonds. In reaching this conclusion, the pair relied on data gathered by British biophysicist Maurice Wilkins, 1916 to 2004. In the Watson-Crick model, each rung of the DNA ladder consists of two pairs of chemicals. When DNA is replicated, which it is during reproduction, the ladder rungs are divided and the legs form new ladders, identical to the original. The model has helped scientists understand how genetic traits are passed from parent to offspring. Cells in the human body have 46 chromosomes, arranged in 23 pairs. Children inherit half a set of chromosomes. Thread-like bodies in the nucleus of a cell, from each parent, and different combinations of the parent's DNA. A process called recombination produces offspring of different, though related, inherited characteristics. Each person's genetic information is carried in his or her DNA between 10 and 20 billion miles of it, which is distributed among trillions of cells in the average human body. The study of DNA's structure has proved invaluable to scientists working in the fields of evolution, pathology, forensics, and many others. DNA's fingerprinting ability is so powerful that forensic scientists can use the DNA found on a single strand of human hair to identify the owner. In 1962, Watson, Crick, and Wilkins shared the Nobel Prize for their groundbreaking work on DNA.
What is the Hippocratic Oath?
The Hippocratic Oath is the pledge taken by many medical students upon graduation or upon entering into practice. While the text of the oath varies by translation, one important line reads, "I will prescribe regimen for the good of my patients according to my ability and my judgment, and never to harm anyone." The vows are attributed to the Greek physician and teacher Hippocrates. c. 460 c. 377 BC, who practiced on the island of Kos. Unlike his predecessors, who relied on superstitious practices in their treatment of patients, Hippocrates believed that diseases were brought on not by supernatural causes but by natural ones. He further believed that disease could be studied and cured. This assertion forms the basis of modern medicine, which is why Hippocrates is called the father of medicine. It is largely owing to another prominent Greek physician that the oath was handed down through history. Galen, AD 129 c. 199, was physician to Roman emperors Marcus Aurelius 121 to 80, from 161, and Lucius Commodus 161 to 92, from 168. He demonstrated that arteries carry blood, not air, as had been thought, and, like Hippocrates, Galen believed in the four humors of the body. He left medical texts that for centuries were considered the authoritative works on medical practice. Galen's writings reveal his high regard for Hippocrates, who lived and worked many centuries earlier.
How did the civil rights movement begin?
It began on Thursday, December 1, 1955, as Rosa Parks, 1913. A seamstress who worked for a downtown department store in Montgomery, Alabama, made her way home on the Cleveland Avenue bus. Parks was seated in the first row that was designated for blacks. But the white rows in the front of the bus soon filled up. When Parks was asked to give up her seat so that a white man could sit, she refused. She was arrested and sent to jail. Montgomery's black leaders had already been discussing staging a protest against racial segregation on the city buses. They soon organized, with Baptist minister Martin Luther King Jr. 1929 to 1968, as their leader. Beginning on December 5, 1955, thousands of black people refused to ride the city buses. The Montgomery bus boycott had begun. It lasted more than a year, 382 days, and ended only when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation on the buses was unconstitutional. The protesters and civil rights activists had emerged the victors in this their first and momentous effort to end segregation and discrimination in the United States. Parks, who lost her job as a result of the arrest, later explained that she had acted on her own beliefs that she was being unfairly treated. But in so doing, Parks had taken a stand and had given rise to a movement.
Why is the ballet's Russes famous?
The notoriety of the ballet's Russes began on a May night in 1909. It was then that the company, created by Russian impresario Sergei Diaghilev, 1872 to 1929, performed innovative ballet choreographed by Michel Faucon, 1880 to 1942. The Parisian audience, made up of the city's elite, was wowed by the choreography, set design, and musical scores, as well as the performances of the lead dancers, the athletic vigor of Vaslav Nijinsky, the delicate beauty of Tamara Karsavina, the expressiveness of Anna Pavlova, and the exotic quality of Ida Rubinstein. Ballet had been freed of the constraints and conventions that had held it captive. The art form was reawakened. The reforms were on every level: choreography, performance, costuming, and design. The company's chief set designer was Leon Bakst, 1866 to 1924, whose sense of color had influenced not only stage designs but even women's fashions. Soon Diaghilev and the ballet's Russes were at the center of the art world. Major 20th-century painters, including Robert Edmond Jones, Pablo Picasso, André Derain, Henri Matisse, and Joan Miro, created set and costume designs for the dance company. And Diaghilev commissioned music that could match the spectacular dancing, choreography, and decor of his ballets. History's most celebrated composers, including Maurice Ravel, Claude Debussy, Richard Strauss, Sergei Prokofiev, and Igor Stravinsky, provided the scores for the dances performed by ballet's Russes. The company, under Diaghilev's direction, had created a completely different kind of dance drama. bringing ballet out of the shadows of opera and asserting it as an art form unto itself. The ballet companies of today are the lasting legacy of the ballets Russes. Diaghilev illustrated that through a collaborative process, excellent art could be created outside the traditional academy. The ballets Russes provided 20th-century dance with the model of the touring ballet company and seasonal repertory.
Why is Brahms's First Symphony sometimes called Beethoven's 10th?
In many ways, Johannes Brahms, 1833 to 1897, was the inheritor of Beethoven's genius, prompting some music historians to refer to Brahms's First Symphony as Beethoven's 10th. This is not to diminish the work of the great 19th-century composer, who left an enduring corpus of works. Brahms demonstrated that classicism continued to have artistic validity and was not incompatible with the romanticism of the late 19th century.
What happened to the tablets on which the 10 Commandments were written?
Chapter 32 of the Book of Exodus explains that while Moses was up on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments from God, the Israelites who were waiting below grew impatient, and soon prevailed upon Aaron to make us a god who will be our leader. As for the man Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. And so Aaron did what the people wanted. He proceeded to collect gold jewelry from the Israelites and then fashioned the jewelry into a golden calf. When Moses came down the mountain, he saw the people rejoicing and dancing before the calf. Enraged, Moses threw the 2 tablets, which were inscribed on both sides, to the ground, smashing them. Later, the Bible explains, in Exodus 34:1-4, that God instructed Moses to carve new stone tablets like the other ones, which he did. These tablets were placed in the Ark of the Covenant, as God had told Moses. People sometimes see the 10 Commandments as divided into 2 groups. The first group covers the relationship between people and God, and the second covers relationships among people.
What is known about Homer?
It is most likely that Homer was an oral poet and performer. Though little is known about Homer, it's believed that he was an Ionian Greek who lived circa the 8th or 9th century BC. In the 1920s, scholar Milman Parry proved that Homer's poems were formulaic in nature, relying on generic epithets, such as wine-dark sea and rosy-fingered dawn. Repetition of stock lines and descriptions and themes typical of oral folk poetry. All of this suggested that Homer was most likely a bard or rhapsodian, itinerant professional reciter who improvised pieces to be sung at Greek festivals.
What was trial by battle?
Like trial by ordeal. Trial by battle was a method of justice used predominantly during the Middle Ages, 500–1350. When noblemen had disputes, they would engage in a duel with one other. The assumption was that the person who was in the right would have God on his side, and he would emerge the victor in combat. No questions asked. This form of trial was gradually replaced by trial by jury.
Who developed printing?
If printing is defined as the process of transferring repeatable designs onto a surface, then the first known printing was done by the Mesopotamians, who as early as 3000 B.C. used stamps to impress designs onto wet clay. Printing on paper developed much later. Chinese inventor Tizhe Ailun AD-C 50–C 118, is credited with producing the first paper in AD 105. During the Tiang dynasty, 618–906, Chinese books were printed with inked wood blocks, and it was the Chinese not German printer Johannes Gutenberg, c. 1390–1468, as is widely believed, who developed movable type, allowing printers to compose a master page from permanent, raised characters. However, movable type printing did not catch on in medieval China because the Chinese language has some 80,000 characters. Printers found it more convenient to use carved blocks.
Why did the United States get involved in Vietnam?
The policy of involvement in the Vietnam conflict began in the mid-1950s when President Harry S. Truman, 1884–1972, provided U.S. support to the French in their struggle to retain control of Vietnam, which was then part of French Indochina. In the Cold War era, 1947–89, government leaders believed that the United States must come to the assistance of any country threatened by communism. Truman's successors in the White House, Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1890–1969, John F. Kennedy, 1917–1963, and Lyndon B. Johnson, 1908–1973, also followed this school of thought. Fearing a domino effect among neighboring nations, if one fell, they'd all fall.
What was the Dust Bowl?
The Dust Bowl was the most severe drought in U.S. history. In the spring of 1934, the country in the grips of the Great Depression. Farmers across the Great Plains of the United States witnessed two great dust storms. First, in mid-April, after days of hot, dry weather and cloudless skies, 40 to 50 mile-per-hour winds picked up and took with them the dry soil, resulting in thick, heavy clouds. In Texas and Oklahoma, these dirt clouds engulfed the landscape. The next month was extremely hot. And on May 10 the second storm came up as the gales returned, this time creating a light brown fog. On May 11 experts estimated that 12 million tons of soil fell on Chicago as the dust storm blew in off the Great Plains. And the same storm darkened the skies over Cleveland. On May 12 the dust clouds had reached the eastern seaboard. Between the two storms, 650 million tons of topsoil had blown off the plains. The resulting dust bowl covered 300,000 square miles across New Mexico, eastern Colorado, Texas, western Oklahoma, and Kansas. The damage was great. Crops, principally wheat, were cut off at ground level or torn from their roots. Cattle that ate dust-laden grass eventually died from mud balls. Dust drifted, creating banks against barns and houses. While families tried to keep it from penetrating the cracks and crevices of their homes by using wet blankets, oiled cloths, and tape, only to still have everything covered in grit. Vehicles and machinery were clogged with dirt. In addition to the farmers who died in the fields. Suffocated by the storm, hundreds of people suffered from dust pneumonia.
What was the Dirty War?
This is the name that has been given to a troubling chapter in Mexico's recent history. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, thousands of left-wing reformists were killed in Mexico. And hundreds more went missing and are presumed to have been killed. After the 2000 election of reform-minded President Vicente Fox, 1942. The human rights abuses of Mexico's Dirty War era at last were being investigated. In June 2002, secret security files were released detailing the government's iron-fisted crackdown on its opponents during the late 1960s and into the 1970s. In July 2002, former Mexican President Luis Echeverría, 1922, was called before a special prosecutor, who quizzed the octogenarian about two massacres that occurred when he was a high-ranking government official and then president. In the two events, one in 1968 and the other in 1971, anti-government protesters were beaten and shot. Echeverría and his presidential successor, José López Portillo, 1920–2004. Both denied any involvement in the events or in the disappearance of radicals who actively protested their regimes. In late February 2005, Mexico's Supreme Court, citing a 30-year time limit, ruled that Echeverría could not be tried on alleged human rights abuses. The decision was considered a setback for Fox's reform efforts, which centered on punishing past crimes. But the special prosecutor in the case did not rule out bringing other charges against Echeverría, saying the former president ordered men loyal to him to attack student demonstrators.
Who was Pythagoras?
known by students today for the Pythagorean theorem, the square of the length of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the lengths of the other two sides. Pythagoras, c. 580 500 BC, was a Greek philosopher and mathematician who lived in the 6th century BC and whose followers kept Pythagoreanism alive into the middle of the 4th century BC. Religious in nature. Some have referred to the society as a cult. Pythagoreans believed in the functional and even mystical significance of numbers and made considerable advances in mathematics and astronomy. Pythagoras left no writings, which has prompted some scholars to believe that no such person ever existed. But rather, any doctrines ascribed to him are actually attributable to a group of people. Whatever the case, the Pythagorean legacy is real. It includes the word calculus. Pythagoreans used lines, triangles, and squares made of pebbles to represent numbers. The Latin word for pebble is calculus, the rendering of astronomy and music in numerical patterns, which were studied as mathematical subjects, and the first suggestion, as early as the 6th century BC, that Earth is spherical, not flat, and that Earth, the Moon, and the planets revolve around the Sun.
What is Golgotha?
Golgotha is the Hebrew name for Calvary. The site on a hillside outside ancient Jerusalem where Jesus Christ, c. 6 BCE AD 30, was crucified. Though the exact site is unknown. It is believed to be where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located.
When were the major waves of immigration to the United States?
The first wave of immigration was during colonial times, when most new arrivals to North America were from England. But other European countries were represented as well, including France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Wales. By 1700, roughly 250,000 people lived in the American colonies. By the beginning of the American Revolution, 1775 to 83, the number had climbed to 700,000. Some of these new arrivals had been encouraged to immigrate by Virginia's head right system. Englishmen who could pay their own Atlantic crossing were granted 50 acres of land. Each of their sons and servants were also granted an additional 50 acres. Other colonies also adopted the head right system, with the land amounts varying in each. Other immigrants in this first wave were poor and could not afford the price of the transatlantic passage. By signing a contract agreeing to work as an indentured servant for a period of typically 3 to 7 years, their fare was paid by their future master. At the end of this period, the servant became a freeman and was usually granted land, tools, or money by the former master. During the American Revolution and for several decades after, the flow of immigrants into the new country slowed. A second wave of immigration began in 1820. During the next 50 years, nearly 7.5 million newcomers arrived in the United States. Many were Irish who escaped the effects of the Great Famine back home. Settling the cities along the eastern U.S. seaboard. An equal number, roughly a third, were German, who settled the nation's interior farmlands, particularly the Midwest. An economic depression in the 1870s stemmed the tide of immigrants, but only for a short time. Between 1881 and 1920, a third wave brought more than 23 million immigrants to American shores. These new arrivals were largely from Eastern and Southern Europe. German immigration reached its peak in 1882. In 1883, the United States saw the peak of immigration from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and China. Just after the turn of the century, in 1902, U.S. immigration set new records as people from Italy, Austro-Hungary, and Russia made the transatlantic journey. Between 1920 and 1965, immigration slowed. In the last 3.5 decades of the 20th century and into the 21st, a fourth wave of immigration has taken place. In spring 1998, the U.S. Census Bureau released a report citing that 9.6% of American residents are foreign-born, or roughly 1 in every 10. This is the highest percentage reported since the 1930s, when 11.6% of U.S. residents were natives of another country, a result of the third wave of immigration, 1881 to 1920. However, the origin countries have shifted. Latin Americans now account for about half of all new arrivals. 1/4 are Asian-born, and 1/5 are European.
What was the Taliban?
It was the ultra-conservative faction that ruled Afghanistan from late 1996 until December 2001. When its government crumbled following a U.S.-led military campaign. The Persian word Taliban means students. The group was made up of Afghan refugees who, during the Soviet invasion, 1979–89, had fled their country for Pakistan, where they attended conservative Islamic religious schools. After the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan and amidst the unrest that ensued, the Taliban rose to prominence. They gained control of the nation region by region, eventually taking the capital of Kabul in 1996. While in power, the group put into force strict laws based on a fundamental interpretation of Islam. The Taliban excluded women from Afghan society, and it allowed the nation to become a training ground for Islamic terror groups such as Al-Qaeda. Very few nations of the world recognized the Taliban government. Its human rights abuses, principally the complete disenfranchisement of women and girls, were decried by the international community. But the breaking point came after the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks on the U.S. homeland. when the American government requested that the suspected mastermind of those attacks be extradited from Afghanistan to the United States, the Taliban refused. The group was forcibly ousted in the brief military campaign that followed. In December 2001, the United Nations, UN, convened a conference in Bonn, Germany, where leaders of anti-Taliban ethnic factions decided on a post-Taliban transitional government, led by Pashtun leader Hamid Karzai. The Pashtuns are the dominant group in Afghanistan, representing about 42% of the population. The next largest group is the Tajik, which represents about 27% of the population in the highly fragmented nation of 28.5 million people. Attendees also agreed to an unled peacekeeping operation. Though ethnic rivalries and sporadic conflicts continued under the transitional government, Afghanistan made strides in building a stable, democratic government. One encouraging sign of reform came in March 2005, with the appointment of Habiba Sorabi, the first woman to become a provincial governor in Afghanistan history. Sorabi was chosen by the president for her post, which she assumed in late March. When did the U.S.
Why does the President of the United States give a State of the Union address?
The U.S. Constitution requires the President to annually present a joint session of Congress, attended by representatives and senators, with a status report on the nation. Presidents George Washington, 1732–1799, and John Adams, 1735–1826. The first and second presidents delivered their messages in person. Thereafter, the State of the Union was sent as a written message, which was read in Congress. But President Woodrow Wilson, 1856–1924, delivered his messages in person, including that of January 1918, when he delivered the 14 points, his formulation of a peace program for Europe once World War I. 1914–18, had ended. Since Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882–1945, held office, beginning in 1933, all U.S. presidents have made formal addresses to Congress.
Who is the Dalai Lama?
The Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader of Lamaism, a Buddhist sect in Tibet. The title, first bestowed on a Lamaist leader in 1578, translates as teacher whose wisdom is great as the ocean. The title has been bestowed 13 times since. Followers believe that the Dalai Lama is continually reborn. Monks go in search of a young boy who was born at about the same time as the Dalai Lama died. They seek other signs of continuity as well before identifying the new Dalai Lama, who the monks educate and train to assume the leadership role.
Are apostles and disciples the same thing?
No. The apostles were the 12 followers chosen by Jesus, c. 6b.cc AD 30. As described in the New Testament of the Bible. The term apostle is also used to identify other early missionaries, such as Barnabas and Paul. Saul, who in Acts 13:2-3 are singled out by the Holy Spirit to be missionaries. A disciple is any follower of Jesus. Therefore, all the apostles were disciples. But not all disciples were apostles.
What advances were made in medicine during the Renaissance?
The chief advance of the Renaissance, 1350 to 1600, was an improved understanding of the human anatomy. This knowledge was the direct result of dissection, which was prohibited during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. The scientific spirit of the Renaissance saw those laws relaxed, and researchers were free to dissect human corpses for study. Among those who practiced dissection was Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519. While the Italian artist may be better known for the Mona Lisa, he also contributed greatly to the understanding of human anatomy, producing more than 750 anatomical drawings as a result of his studies in dissection.
When were antibiotics invented?
The idea of antibiotics, substances that destroy or inhibit the growth of certain other microorganisms, dates back to the late 19th century. But the first antibiotics were not produced until well into the 20th century. The great French chemist Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895, laid the foundation for understanding antibiotics when in the late 1800s he proved that one species of microorganisms can kill another. German bacteriologist Paul Ehrlich, 1854 to 1915, then developed the concept of selective toxicity, in which a specific substance can be toxic, poisonous, to some organisms but harmless to others. Based on this research, scientists began working to develop substances that would destroy disease-spreading microorganisms. A breakthrough came in 1928 when Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming, 1881 to 1955, discovered penicillin. Fleming observed that no bacteria grew around the mold of the genus Penicillium notatum, which had accidentally fallen into a bacterial culture in his laboratory. But penicillin proved difficult to extract. It was not until more than a decade later, in 1941, that the substance was purified and tested by British scientist Howard Florey, 1898 to 1968. Another British scientist, Ernst Boris Chain, 1906 to 1979, developed a method of extracting penicillin. and under his supervision the first large-scale penicillin production facility was completed, making the antibiotic commercially available in 1945. That same year, Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their work in discovering and producing the powerful antibiotic, still used today in the successful treatment of bacterial diseases, including pneumonia, strep throat, and gonorrhea. The term antibiotic was coined by American microbiologist Selman A. Waxman, 1888 to 1973, who tested about 10,000 types of soil bacteria for antibiotic capability. In 1943, Waxman discovered a fungus that produced a powerful antibiotic substance, which he called streptomycin. The following year, the antibiotic was in production for use in treating tuberculosis, typhoid fever, bubonic plague, and bacterial meningitis. Although streptomycin was later found to be toxic, it saved countless lives and led to the discovery of many other antibiotics, which have proven both safe and effective.
Why is the exodus from Egypt so well known?
The exodus of the Jews from Egypt, an event recorded in the Bible and corroborated by historical evidence, is well known to Jews and non-Jews alike, since the event, which Jews commemorate with Passover, came to symbolize departure from oppressive conditions, for the Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt. According to the Bible, the Old Testament books of Genesis and Exodus, the ancestors of the Israelites had settled in the Nile River delta of Egypt 430 years before the Exodus, or about the 17th century BC. A change of dynasty caused the Israelites, because of their growing numbers, to be looked upon with hostility. They were put to work as state serfs in the construction of cities. The biblical account tells about a series of confrontations between Ramses II, the Pharaoh of Egypt, and the prophet Moses, who had been commissioned by God to lead his people to the promised land. The Pharaoh refused to allow the Israelites to leave Egypt but was later convinced, through a series of divine signs including the 10 plagues, to permit them to go. The flight from Egypt and the promised land have come to symbolize freedom and the realization of hopes.
What is the incidence of conflict in Africa?
Since the end of World War II, 1939 to 45, there have been at least 56 separate, identifiable conflicts in Africa, with about a dozen of them ongoing in 2005. The continent seemed to be in a state of turmoil, with conflicts ranging from regional skirmishes between warlords to civil war. The unimaginable horrors of the Rwandan genocide, 1994, the decades-old civil unrest and ethnic cleansing in Sudan, and long-standing rebel violence in Uganda made news the world over. The war-ravaged image of Africa caused many observers to wonder if the continent was unusually prone to civil war. In a study published by the World Bank, researchers concluded in 2000 that Africa has had a similar incidence of civil conflict to that of other developing regions. And that, with minor exceptions, its conflicts are consistent with the global pattern. The authors of that report acknowledged that the rising trend of conflict in Africa was due to its atypically poor economic performance. While many could see only Africa as war-torn, others pointed to the fact that most of Africa's nations were peaceful, and that the trouble spots gave the international community an overstated impression of despair on the continent.
What caused the Reformation?
The religious movement during the 16th century also had political and cultural causes. As more and more people were converted to Christianity during the Middle Ages, 500-1350, the Pope's sphere of influence gradually increased, giving him greater authority than many secular rulers. This supremacy was defended by Pope Innocent III, c. 1160-1216, one of the most prominent figures of the Middle Ages, who asserted that the Church should rightly retain its full power in both secular and spiritual matters. But in Western Europe, the monarchs became increasingly powerful as peasants began moving away from their farms and villages and to the emerging cities, which were protected by kings and emperors. The European monarchs often opposed the Pope, regarding him as a leader of a foreign state. This conflict continued for centuries. In 1309 Pope Clement V, c. 1260-1314, did something that would later divide the Roman Catholic Church when, being French himself, he moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon, France, where it stayed for 70 years. When Pope Gregory XI, 1329-1378, moved it back to Rome in 1377, some French cardinals objected and elected a pope of their own, an anti-pope, installing him at Avignon. This resulted in two popes claiming supremacy. And in 1409 the situation grew more complicated when a third pope was added in Pisa, Italy. Not only had the power struggle divided the Church, it had created tremendous confusion for the people, who further perceived that there were corrupt practices at work in the Church. These included the selling of church positions and indulgences, pardons for sins, as well as the lavish lifestyle enjoyed by the bishops and the Pope, which was on a par with that of royalty. While these injustices were decried by critics, the abuses did not stop. As a remedy, some began to think that the Church should be led not by the Pope but by church councils. Dissatisfaction with the Church also extended to its message, which had turned away from God's mercy and the teachings of Jesus Christ, instead focusing on a life of good works as the way to salvation. Europe was also in the midst of the Renaissance, 1350 to 1600, which saw a proliferation in the number of universities, the circulation of printed materials, thanks to the advent of the movable type printing press, and broader study of classic texts as well as of the Holy Scriptures in their original languages instead of how they had been handed down in translation by the Church. Before long, a middle class of educated people emerged in Europe. These circumstances combined to bring about a period of religious reform that lasted until 1648. The movement itself, however, continued to exert influence through its emphasis on personal responsibility, individual freedom, and the secularization of society.
Why was Ford's Model T important?
The enormous success of the Model T, a Ford Motor Company car introduced in 1908 and manufactured until 1927, has been the source of extensive analysis and commentary by historians, sociologists, economists, business writers, and pop culture experts. The Model T has been credited with not only changing America but with defining it. When Ford Motor Company founder and President Henry Ford, 1863 to 1947, unveiled the prize Model T in October 1908, he hailed it as a motor car for the great multitude. The product lived up to the promise. The internal combustion vehicle had been in production in the United States only since the 1890s. But in the decade preceding the Model T's debut, manufacturers and consumers alike had come to regard the horseless carriage as a luxury item, custom-made for wealthy Americans. Ford had conceived of a different and, as the company would advertise throughout the century, a better idea, a car that was simple to operate, easy to service, comfortable, and affordable. The Model T had a wooden body on a steel frame, 4-cylinder, 20-horsepower engine. Tank capacity of 10 gallons, in the touring sedan, or 16 gallons. In the runabout, and a completely enclosed power plant and transmission. It was also lighter than other models. Through large-scale production, based on a system of interchangeable parts, the Model T took 728 minutes, just more than 12 hours, to build and sold for $850, lower than the price of other automobiles, but still beyond the reach of the average American. Nevertheless, 17,000 Model Ts were bought by American consumers the year they were introduced. Ford improved production methods to realize greater economies and lower the price each year. Sales steadily rose. The company raised eyebrows in the business community when it offered workers an 8-hour day for $5 a day, twice what other factory workers were earning. Ford explained that this was merely good business practice. By raising the wages of his factory workers, Ford enlarged the potential market for his Model T. In 1914, Ford implemented the moving assembly line. It used the principles of scientific management, where each job has one best way of being accomplished, to bring unprecedented efficiency to manufacturing. Assembly time per car dropped to just 90 minutes. That year the Ford plant in Highland Park, Michigan, produced almost 250,000 Model Ts. To keep up with ever-rising demand, operations were sped up and capacity increased to the point that one day in 1925, Ford produced one Model T every 10 seconds. That year the car retailed for just $295, making the so-called Tin Lizzie, or the Flivver, accessible to working-class families. By 1927, when Ford retired the Model T so the company could respond to consumer demand for cars with better performance, power, and styling, the company had turned out 15 million Tin Lizzies. Ford's innovative Model T, a reliable, no-nonsense, mass-produced automobile. Manufactured on a moving assembly line, brought mobility within the reach of the average American. It had changed consumer mindset to view the car as a necessity.
What was the Cuban Missile Crisis?
The 1962 events, which happened very quickly, nevertheless constituted a major confrontation of the Cold War, 1947–89. After the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, when the United States backed Cuban expatriates in an attempt to oust Fidel Castro. 1926, the Soviet Union quietly began building missile sites in Cuba. Since the island nation is situated just south of Florida, when U.S. reconnaissance flights detected the Soviet military construction projects there, it was an alarming discovery. On October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy, 1917–1963, demanded that the Soviet Union withdraw its missiles from Cuba. Kennedy also ordered a naval blockade of the island. 6 days later, the Soviets agreed to dismantle the sites, ending the crisis.
What was the Norman Conquest?
The Norman Conquest is the brief but critical period in British history that began when the French Duke William of Normandy, c. 1028–1087, sailed across the English Channel in 1066 and invaded England. This was upon the death of what would turn out to be England's last Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, c. 1003–1066, while William became known as William the Conqueror. And he did conduct a brutal conquest of Anglo-Saxon England, he might have had reason to believe. He could claim the English throne upon King Edward's death. The named successor, Harold, c. 1022–1066, of the powerful Wessex family, had 2 years earlier become shipwrecked off the coast of France, where he reportedly took an oath that he would, upon King Edward's death, support William of Normandy, who was King Edward's distant cousin, as heir. Hearing of Edward's death, William and his army set sail for England, where Harold had already assumed the throne as King Harold II. But Harold had previously quarrelled with his brother Tostig. and the noble Wessex family was divided and engaged in a power struggle. Tostig was joined in his fight by the Norwegians who, at the same time that William was landing on England's southern coast, invaded from the north. Thus, William and his troops entered England without opposition. Since Harold was focusing his efforts elsewhere. Though the king defeated the Norwegians and Tostig, who was slain in battle, he would not emerge the victor in his subsequent battle with William. On October 14 the two met in battle at Hastings, near the entrance to the Strait of Dover. Though he fought valiantly, Harold was killed. William was crowned at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066. Within a few years. By 1070, he had killed many Anglo-Saxon nobles and the rest he deprived of their land. In the 21 years of his reign, William imposed Norman aristocracy on England. Required that French be spoken at court, and drew England closer to Europe. He ruled until his death in 1087. After which the Norman nobility mixed with what was left of the Anglo-Saxons. It is this intermingling that produced the English language from the German tongue of the Anglo-Saxons combined with the Norman French. William's descendants, albeit distantly so, have ruled England ever since his takeover in 1066.